All right. So, hello everyone. Um, my name is Neal Gompa. I'm here to talk to you about building Debian packages the RPM way with debbuild. So, I want to talk a little bit about who I am just for a second. So, I kind of consider myself a professional technologist. I've been doing stuff with computers and other technologies since I was a little kid. I've been a Linux user for nearly 15 years and a contributor and developer in Fedora, Magia, OpenSUSE, and Mandriva Linux distributions, among many others. If you've ever seen, if you've ever looked a little deeply into a major Linux distribution, I probably have a little thing here and there and there. I'm a contributor to RPM, DNF, and various related projects. I'm the current developer of debbuild and the creator of debbuild-macros, which I will introduce in a little bit. And for my day job, I'm a senior DevOps engineer at Datto Inc. And to just a little bit about Datto, just to kind of explain, context where this is coming from. So Datto was founded in 2007. We're around 1,600 employees in large. We operate entirely in the channel, so we sell indirect. We work through managed service providers, and we operate globally with 22 locations all across the world. We serve many, many small to medium businesses, providing various solutions of disaster recovery, unified continuity networking, file professional services, remote management, commerce, and so on. But a little bit of the intro stuff out of the way, I want to talk about building Debian packages the traditional way. So the problem with Debian packages, it starts with Datto uses Ubuntu for a lot of our products and service infrastructure. So in order for us to extend the operating system with capabilities we need, we have to build packages in the deb format because, in order for us to plug components in, upgrade them, whatever, they have to fit with the rest of the system. Debian packages are typically built with something called Debian source control, which is, if you've seen the .dsc file, DSC stands for that. This is the default promoted structure in which you construct a deb file with. This is, usually you can see this in a source tree as you have a source code plus a Debian folder that's merged together into one source tree, and then dpackage build package actually runs through and builds it, and it takes that and runs through actions that are described in various files to then produce the packages. This is kind of difficult for people to work with because the complexity of the Debian policy, along with the magic plus fractured way of structuring a Debian package, and the conventions required by dpackage build package to accept the inputs as valid, makes it hard for people to get right. So I kind of want to just show real quick, like this is from the Debian GNU Hello package in Debian, and this shows like super basic. This is with deb helper. So this is the magic deb helper form, which is what a lot of packages do. So you can see there's a control file with a lot of metadata. There's a changelog file with the changes, and importantly, the changelog file actually has control information because it describes the version of the package. And then in the top right, you have the rules file, which actually just makes it point to a helper tool to run to make the build. And then the bottom right part is actually, it says the source format. This is describing the input structure. So there are multiple ways for the Debian merge source tree to be constructed. So you could have a quote unquote sort of pristine tarball along with a Debian tarball, and then a DSC file that describes that the two should be bound together, and it unpacks and mangles them into one source tree. Or you can have one that's done with the tarball plus a giant super patch that applies on top of the tarball, or you can have them all as one tarball, and these are all described different ways through this format thing that tells dpackage build package how to actually unpack the sources to get the instructions to build the package. However, there are a lot of packages that tend to be more complex than that, and it often involves doing some weird, pulling back into the metadata, doing some parsing, accessing environment stuff. going back and forth between makefile templates and shell script templates and these sorts of things, and this hello traditional, which is one that doesn't use deb helper and uses more of the basic tooling directly, is more similar to that. There's actually a few other systems like CDBS, Common Debian Build System, and a couple of other variants based on deb helper that you can kind of see how this stuff works. But I just wanted to illustrate the basic package complexity up front. A lot of these have things in common, but there's also some things that are different. But the idea is, hopefully this is illustrative of what we're looking at here. So the problem with Debian packages is that people got it wrong all the time. When we were building Debian packages a traditional way, we often had people, trying to hack and slash their way into making it successful, because working with the different pieces and the it's not very prescriptive the way the Debian policy is written. It doesn't really give you as many concrete examples, or at least it didn't in the past, very many concrete examples of how you worked with Debian packages to build them and construct them from scratch and whatever. And this made it difficult for people to figure out how to use them for their own things. So they would wind up either copying something from another package that looks similar, or just kind of hitting it until it worked. And in a lot of cases, what wound up happening was that packages would look like they worked, and then they were subtly broken in some way because there wasn't enough understanding of the interplay between the Debian source control mechanisms and how the Debian build process actually works to result in a conformant Debian package. There were a couple of incidents where something looked perfectly fine, but the package that was released was completely empty because there was something fat-fingered or not really expressed correctly that would lead to the Debian package being successfully collected with no files. And if it hadn't been caught at the very last stage with some smoke test, it probably would have been released and we would have had a lot of problems. That was the kind of stuff that was endemic to the way we were doing it before. And this got piled on top of when we started offering software that customers installed onto their system. So the Data Linux backup agent, which was installable on not only Ubuntu systems, but RHEL, CentOS, Fedora, OpenSUSE, and so on. Like we had to expand our range of distributions, and it was increasingly difficult to get people to have the headspace to be able to deal with both formats at the same time and both build tooling. We, of course, explored other ways of trying to deal with this, like abstracting beyond both of them and stuff like that. But what we also wanted to do was try to ensure we had correctness in our packages in the first place. And so that kind of led us to building Debian packages using debbuild. So debbuild is a tool that emulates the RPM build tool from RPM to produce Debian packages. That is, it'll take an RPM spec file and process it and run a package build like RPM build does. But the resulting output is that it produces a deb instead of an RPM archive, and the metadata is reformatted to be something that Debian systems expect. Debbuild-macros is an add-on to debbuild that defines many common packaging macros used in RPM packaging. Often, most of them are actually inspired by or copied from Fedora Linux. So it makes it easy for you to take a Fedora package and then with minor tweaks, or maybe in some cases no tweaks at all, you can run it again and it will actually produce you a valid package for a Debian system. Why that matters is why that was developed was mostly so that we could do things like take a Fedora package that we need as a dependency or an upgraded component that exists in Fedora but not in Ubuntu or Debian, and just bring it backwards into the Ubuntu world so that we could ship it and use it. We actually use debbuild with a build system called the Open Build Service. So it's a software solution that was created by SUSE to build and manage OpenSUSE and SUSE Linux Enterprise distributions. It's similar to Koji, which is the Red Hat Fedora build system, or I forget what the name of the build system is for Ubuntu, Launchpad's Soyuz or something like that. I forget the name of it. And Debian's Build D and Brittany and all those things. Unlike those build systems, the Open Build service was designed from the beginning to support a wide variety of Linux platforms. It can build packages and repositories and images for Red Hat, Fedora, SUSE, and Debian Ubuntu systems. You can access a hosted version of this at the OpenSUSE build service at build.opensuse.org. But we internally run an instance based on the appliance image that they offer at openbuildservice.org. So why we use the Open Build service, it gives us some nice features, source input flexibility. We can scale resources with workers by just provisioning them dynamically. But the biggest thing that we have, aside from the fact that it can build packages natively for RPM and Debian distributions with RPM spec files, it tracks the dependencies of packages as they've been built, and as dependencies drift and change, it triggers rebuilds and publishes them together automatically. So I don't actually have to work through the process of maintaining packages as their dependencies change. Dependencies changing is the easiest part because I don't have to do the rebuilds. It does it for me, and then it publishes them for me, does the correct version, release incrementing, and all that stuff so that they're just straight up usable just out of the box. So building with debbuild on OBS is actually super simple. You create a spec file and you describe it, with the normal metadata that you would for an RPM stuff, and add a couple of extra things. So this is what I do on the OpenSUSE build service for building the same GNU Hello package. You can see here that with one file that has stanzas that are pretty straightforward to understand. You've got your metadata up at the top. The only real extra bit here is this if vendor deb build to add group and packager. So I do it this way mostly because internally at Data we have a style convention where we put this stuff in the spec file. But you could also just define this at the build system level to say this group is set for these, or this packager is always set, and then deb build would inherit it, and then you don't have to do any modifications at all. If you take the vendor part out, this is straight up the same spec file that comes from Fedora, or at least when it was in Fedora. I'm not sure if Hello is back in Fedora or not, but it was at one point. So that spec file works, and you can see here that this package actually built for both Fedora 33 and Ubuntu 2004, and that basically is it. Like it works just straight out of the box this way. When you're building with Debian packages this way, you get to mostly comply with Debian policy just out of the box. Like you can totally comply with it in its entirety if you ship, for example, a copyright file that describes like the extra license, the dep5, I think is what it's called, dep5 or dep8. I think it's dep5. Dep8 is upstream. Dep5 metadata for copyright and licensing data. You can also, if you want to make sure that you have extra metadata files like shlib symbols files and stuff like that, there are macros for just doing those things. But if you don't need all that, it also just becomes super easy to just regularly backport packages from Fedora to our Ubuntu or Debian. We do this with great success, leveraging the quality packaging and simplified maintenance in the process. We do have to account for distro differences because unlike a lot of tools, like I think a popular contender people talk about is FPM. Debbuild doesn't magically account for all the distro differences. You still need to be aware of them. I actually consider this a bit of a plus because that makes it less surprising from behaviorally, and you can understand like what is actually happening in the process, and that makes it easier to debug. One of the downsides of magical building processes is that you don't understand what's happening, and it's super difficult to debug later, whereas debbuild is a fairly straightforward tool. It mechanically follows what you say, and it produces stuff at the end. So here's some references, the debbuild GitHub organizations, and I've got some sample spec files that I've exported from our internal infrastructure that you can take a look at to see how we do this, as well as one that we use in production that for our customers. As I mentioned earlier, the the Data Linux backup agent is done this way, and it was one of the first things we actually did this way. The kernel side component is a driver called datovd, and we have a spec file that produces the user space and the DKMS packages that are compliant for both Debian and RPM distributions, just right out there. And then a reference to the RPM packaging guide if you're kind of new to how RPM packaging works, that'll help. So any questions? I know I think I went a little fast here. My accounting for timing with the 20 minutes for the slot, I kind of wanted to make sure I had enough for people to ask me questions and stuff. So
yeah, I think you're fine. Thanks, Neal. Appreciate it. Ask on Element and on YouTube. There are no questions at the moment. Let's wait and see. There was a bunch of discussions happening in Element, so.
Okay, yeah. I wanted to make sure I gave people time to digest and give me feedback, because I think it makes. I think this is something that I don't know if a lot of people ever thought was a thing in the first place. But we've been using it this way at Datto for actually since I've joined the company, so it's 6 years now.
Okay, here's a question. This is really cool. Does this translate from spec to Debian style sources, or does it re-implement the deb resulting format?
So so in the end, I think we run dpackage deb at the very end to pack the archive, but we generate all the metadata artifacts and we run the build process ourselves. So that means that unlike dpackage build package, which runs all of the build stages in one large stage, we mimic the RPM build process. So we have a prep script stage, we have a build script stage, we have an install script stage. We capture the scriptlets that way and stuff like that. So it intentionally mimics the RPM build process, and we only use enough of the dpackage infrastructure to be able to create the Debian archives at the end. So we even, one thing that's on my hopes and dreams and roadmap is to add support for RPM dependency generators to debbuild, so that we can do fancy things like in the RPM world.
Gotcha. There are a couple of more questions, like, for example, this one here. How is RPM spec picked versus, say, using a third format and generate RPM in deep package format?
So the tool actually already existed at the time that I was looking to solve this problem. And one of the reasons why we picked the RPM spec format and why I picked debbuild and did it this way was I'm a Fedora guy and I'm an RPM guy, and so I was familiar with it, but also because there were other tools like FPM and Alien and a couple of other things that were out there that people were proposing that we use. They all didn't do a good job of producing packages for anything. And so that made me rather unhappy. And I didn't really want to have more complexity in terms of figuring out what's going well and what's going wrong. And I just wanted to have a build process that I could clearly understand and debug, and people wouldn't be too surprised from. And RPM spec with debbuild was already a thing. And so it satisfied my needs, and the OpenSUSE build service had support for it. So we went with that.
Okay, another one here. Mark, is there any relation to Alien?
No. I knew of Alien's existence. Alien was actually at one point considered a contender for this, to do this. Like, we would start with debs or start with RPMs and then just alien them to the other format. But every time I've done that and I've looked at it, they were broken. They didn't work very well. So I just didn't want to deal with it. And it comes back down to, like, if you can't be aware of the distro differences and account for them in the build process, you will get broken packages in weird ways, like CPack and from CMake and others like that.
Okay. Next one from Axel. Are you aware of the existence of the debbuild in Debian?
Oh, yeah. So the tool debbuild and the tool debbuild So debbuild was named like some point in 2005 by the first developer. And like by the time it came to my hands, like I was aware of both, but the name had already been there, and it was just kind of, it is what it is. I didn't choose this name, and it is what, and I'm kind of stuck with it. But it is a very unfortunate thing that they were both a thing.
Yeah, naming is hard. I mean,
naming is very hard.
Yeah, I mean, another one from Luca here is a big one. Does this deal with all the Debianisms that are dealt with natively by Deb helper, like debconf integration and other triggers, hooks, Debian specific stuff? So,
I have slowly been developing practices around doing these things. It isn't, some of these Debianisms are handled and some of them aren't. I would actually mostly say that they're not handled because my packaging philosophy internally at Datto has been to avoid them because they suck and they're anti-automation. But there are ways to integrate them, and I have in limited circumstances actually plugged those in. It's just, it hasn't been a priority for me. If there are people who are interested in adding capabilities for that, for sure. I have, for example, shlib-deps macros in debbuild-macros to be able to generate them for library subpackages, but I don't have them. I don't have them on the full balance of things because it's just not needed for us.
Right. I mean, another one here from Reinhard. How well does debbuild support substar? I don't know.
Oh yeah, substitution variables.
Oh my God.
Yeah, substitution variables. I know what you're talking about. So debbuild doesn't use that mechanism at all because we use the macro engine instead. So the RPM macro engine essentially is a superset of the capabilities that Debian's dpackage, build package, substitution variables have. Shlib-deps, we have a macro that you can use to call, to generate those and slot them into the Debian metadata for a subpackage. We have an internally built dependency generator inside of debbuild, which I want to extract and make it into a separate script that does shlib-deps for external dependencies. And I want to make this more configurable, more customizable in the future. It's just haven't had time to do it yet.
Gotcha. So last question from Nuclear Sandwich. How does debbuild handle the different dependencies and package naming conventions, such as lib foo-dev on Debian or foo-devel on Fedora?
So that's up to you, and that's actually, in my opinion, the best part. You define these when you say your build require stanzas. You could say if vendor equals debbuild, you define your Debian dependency, or you could say if Debian and if Ubuntu, this Debian dependencies, else RPM dependencies. The pattern we have at Datto is we do if vendor equals debbuild. I mean, we could do if Debian or Ubuntu, but if vendor debbuild is what we use. And we define all the Debian ones, and then we do an else, and then we do the RPM ones like so. That makes it easier for us to keep track of them both. And yeah, it's a little bit duplicative, but it also gives us the flexibility of dealing with cases like a dependency doesn't exist in Debian or Fedora, and we can account for them differently. And so the explicitness, I think, makes it better than like what some other tools do, which is just magic rename mappings.
All right, Neal, I think that's it. No more questions. Thank you very much for this interesting talk. I appreciate your